More than 90% of the world's DRAM market is controlled by just 3 companies: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. For decades, they've had the power to influence how much you pay for RAM, when prices rise, and when they fall. That dominance may finally be coming to an end. Corsair, one of the world's best-selling memory brands, has quietly started using chips from a Chinese company called CXMT in some of its DDR5 memory modules. There was no announcement, no marketing campaign, and no public statement. But the most surprising part isn't that Corsair is using Chinese memory chips. It's that CXMT has existed for less than 10 years and has already reached a level of quality high enough for Corsair to sell its products without most customers even realizing the difference. That alone is a much bigger signal than it first appears. Over the next few minutes, you'll understand exactly why. But first, let's rewind a bit, because none of this happened overnight. Back in 2024, several users noticed something unusual. They bought Corsair Vengeance DDR5 memory kits, installed them, and everything worked perfectly. But when they checked the chip information using tools like CPU-Z or Typhoon Burner, the manufacturer wasn't Samsung, SK Hynix, or Micron. Instead, they found a name that most people had never heard before: CXMT, short for Changshin Memory Technologies. Here's what makes this story even more interesting. Corsair never announced the switch. Customers discovered it themselves by comparing notes on Reddit, hardware forums, and online communities. As more people started asking questions, Corsair eventually confirmed that it sources memory chips from different suppliers depending on availability. At first glance, the phrase "depending on availability" sounds completely harmless, but it isn't. Corsair doesn't randomly switch suppliers. The company signs long-term contracts and carefully manages its supply chain. If CXMT chips are appearing inside Corsair memory modules, someone made a strategic decision, negotiated an agreement, and committed to using them. That's not an accident. It's a clear signal that something has changed. It's a sign that something significant has changed in the memory industry. Something that's been building for years and is only now becoming visible to everyday consumers. People buying a Corsair memory kit on Amazon expect Korean or American technology, yet they may actually receive modules built with Chinese-made chips. To understand why this matters, though, you first need to understand how the memory market really works. Unlike most technology markets, RAM is essentially a commodity. A Samsung DRAM chip and an SK Hynix chip perform almost the same job. The real difference isn't usually the product itself, it's who manufactures it. And when products are nearly identical, whoever controls supply also controls pricing. That's the key. Whenever the market becomes oversupplied and prices begin falling too much, the 3 major manufacturers, CXMT doesn't need to make the best memory chips in the world to gain market share. It doesn't need to beat Samsung or Micron in top performance. It only needs to be good enough, cheaper, and reliably available at scale, which it already is. Corsair ships millions of modules and wouldn't risk its reputation with low-quality parts. But the key question is how these chips perform in real use compared to Samsung or Micron. In latency and transfer speeds at stock settings, without enabling XMP profiles or overclocking, CXMT chips perform similarly to mid-range Samsung chips, not the top-tier ones. In practice, this means everyday performance is almost indistinguishable for most users. Differences only appear in more demanding scenarios, or when pushing the hardware beyond default specifications, where higher-end Samsung or Micron chips still tend to have an advantage. Where differences become noticeable is in overclocking. Samsung's higher-end chips have a strong reputation for reaching very high frequencies with stable voltages, making them a favorite among enthusiasts. CXMT chips, on the other hand, tend to have a lower and less predictable ceiling. However, most users never overclock their RAM and simply run XMP profiles, meaning they operate within the advertised specs without manual tuning or performance tweaking. For the average buyer, this difference barely matters. Most people who purchase Corsair Vengeance kits simply enable the XMP profile in the BIOS and run the RAM at its advertised speed. In that scenario, performance differences between Samsung, Micron, and CXMT become almost invisible in real-world use. Stability, temperatures, and day-to-day performance remain consistent, which is why many users report no issues. Some users react differently when they discover the chips inside their RAM are Chinese-made, not because of performance issues, but because of perception. This reaction is often based on outdated views of Chinese manufacturing. In reality, CXMT produces chips that meet Corsair's quality standards. However, the biggest factor in this story is not performance or origin, but price. And price is where the real shift in the market begins to appear. This is where the story becomes serious for Samsung and Micron. CXMT is not trying to win by building better chips, but by offering good enough performance at significantly lower prices. In fact, reports suggest discounts of around 20–30% compared to major competitors. In a market where margins are already tight, that gap is huge and forces established players to rethink how they compete without damaging their profitability. That discount is not something CXMT can sustain on its own without support. But it does have support. State-backed funding, subsidies, and a protected domestic market in China with massive demand. This allows it to sell at lower prices for longer periods while scaling production. For Samsung and Micron, which must answer to shareholders every quarter, matching those conditions is extremely difficult without sacrificing margins or long-term. In 2024, China imported around $30 billion worth of DRAM, showing how dependent it has been on foreign memory suppliers. CXMT is now positioned as the main tool to replace those imports with domestic production. With government backing and long-term strategic goals, it can afford aggressive pricing and expansion. This creates pressure on global suppliers, who must compete not only on technology, but also against for established players like Samsung and Micron. This creates a difficult situation. Lowering prices risks destroying margins and triggering pressure from investors, while cutting production opens space for CXMT to gain market share. If CXMT continues expanding capacity, it can steadily fill that gap. Over time, this shifts the balance of power in the memory market, even if its technology is not the most advanced available. Geopolitics adds another layer of complexity. US export restrictions on semiconductor technology are designed to slow China's progress in advanced chips, but they are less effective in DRAM, where CXMT already has enough capability to produce competitive DDR5. As a result, China is not starting from zero. It is building on existing infrastructure and scaling production, making it harder for consumers. This shift could mean lower RAM prices over time as competition increases in a market that has long been dominated by a few companies. However, it also introduces new risks tied to geopolitical tensions and supply chain fragmentation. Memory production is no longer just an industrial competition, but also a strategic issue for governments, meaning the future of pricing and availability will depend on more than just supply and demand. CXMT is still a relatively new player, but its rapid growth shows how quickly the memory market can change when backed by strong industrial policy. If it continues expanding at its current pace, it could eventually challenge established players not only in consumer RAM, but also in server and AI memory markets. That would place it directly in the most profitable segment of the industry, where competition is even more intense. If CXMT manages to enter server and AI memory markets, the impact on the industry would be significantly larger. These segments generate higher margins and are currently dominated by Samsung and Micron, making them strategically important. Even a small share of this market would represent massive revenue and would further increase pressure on existing players to compete on both price and scale in a much more aggressive environment. At the same time, established manufacturers are not standing still. Samsung and Micron have multiple tools to respond, including adjusting production, optimizing supply, and investing in next-generation memory technologies. However, these strategies are constrained by profitability requirements and shareholder expectations. This makes it difficult to directly match state-backed pricing strategies in the short term. Samsung has already responded by reducing production in certain cycles to stabilize prices, a strategy that has worked in past market downturns. However, this approach becomes less effective when a new competitor continues expanding capacity instead of cutting back. As CXMT fills supply gaps, it can gradually capture customers and improve economies of scale, strengthening its position over time in the global memory market. This dynamic creates a structural challenge for the entire industry. Traditional players rely on cyclical supply control to manage pricing, but CXMT operates under different incentives that prioritize long-term expansion over short-term profit stability. As a result, each production cut by established firms risks accelerating CXMT's growth. Over time, this could permanently reshape how memory supply cycles behave and reduce the effectiveness of past pricing strategies. Ultimately, the memory market is entering a new phase driven by scale, pricing pressure, and geopolitical influence. CXMT's rise does not require it to dominate technically, only to remain competitive enough while expanding aggressively. If current trends continue, the industry could shift from a tightly controlled oligopoly to a more fragmented and competitive structure, where price and state support matter as much as performance and brand reputation. This shift also highlights a broader trend in global semiconductor manufacturing: the increasing role of governments in shaping competition. Memory is no longer just a commercial product, but a strategic resource tied to national security and technological independence. As a result, future pricing, innovation, and supply stability will depend not only on corporate decisions, but also on geopolitical strategies and industrial policy decisions made at state level. And that's the full picture. What started as a quiet change inside a few RAM modules actually reflects a much bigger shift in the global memory industry. Competition, pricing power, and geopolitics are all colliding at the same time. Whether this leads to cheaper RAM or a more unstable market depends on how this balance evolves in the coming years. Either way, the industry is no longer what it used to be. This is Chip Wars. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe for more.